Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for May 5th, 2023. Today we're going to begin by looking at the suicidal lunacy of the Western establishment, especially in the US. But I want to begin by thanking all of you who have written to me, sent emails with questions for today, but also those of you who expressed concern about not being able to find these videos as usual. I mentioned yesterday there's been a significant drop in views in the last couple of days, and I'm not sure why that is. I suspect that it has to do with the moves toward controlling the narrative and that we're inconvenient for those trying to control the narrative. But I would urge you, join with us. Make sure you share our videos, join our programs, and help us to make sure that censorship is defeated, because the truth must succeed, and it only succeeds when you have people who are willing to fight for the truth. So join us to do that, and I think, again, I want to thank you for your support, your continued support, and also join the Schiller Institute, become a member, and help us build a real movement that will take power out of the hands of the corrupt current corporate oligarchy. Now, the insanity comes out in the form of, the latest example is downplaying the drone attacks against the Kremlin from 2 days ago. You have Blinken and others who are implying it may have been done by Russia as a false flag. You have Lieutenant General Scott Berrier, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, saying that the Russian claims sound like, quote, misinformation, unquote, the claims that Ukraine was behind this. John Kirby, who is well known for his cover-up of the Seymour Hersh article, his refusal to address serious questions about the policy failures of the US and NATO in Ukraine, Kirby said, quote, "We don't know what happened. We're still assessing that." Then he said, in response to Peskov, the spokesman for Putin, he said, he is, quote, just lying, pure and simple. That's what Kirby said. Now, what did Peskov say? He said that decisions such as choice of targets, choice of means, are dictated to Kiev by Washington. I think that's unmistakably true. Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry, said Washington, London, and NATO have provided weapons and money and given a political cover and military support to Ukraine. She added that they include intelligence data that's used to determine targets. So given this, how can the US simply dismiss this and act as though it's not a big deal, especially when key Ukrainians are saying that this was meant to be a target of where the May 9th Victory Day celebrations will take place. And of course, as I pointed out yesterday, Victory Day for the neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian government is something they oppose because they supported the Nazis. And it was a victory over the Nazis, which was to a large extent facilitated by the massive sacrifice of people in the Soviet Union and Russia. And the reminder of this for the Nazis in Kiev is not a happy occasion. And so Gerashenko, one of the leading supporters of the neo-Nazi networks in Ukraine, warned that there may be drones that will rain down on that parade on May 9th. So is this really what the US and NATO is supporting, a revival of Nazi policies? Well, it apparently is. And I think what is characteristic of this, the West is described by one source as playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded pistol. Now, to respond to this, it must come from the people. And what's necessary is negotiations to end the war and a move to a new security architecture and a new development architecture. This will be the subject of tonight's LaRouche Fireside chat. We'll have a link down below. It will include presentations from Dennis Speed, Dennis Small, Diane Sayre, Jose Vega, and Ray McGovern. So that's something you can watch tonight. And again, get your friends and those you're trying to organize to watch this to get a sense of the real story of what's unfolding in front of us. Now let's get to your questions. I begin with one that I find quite interesting. Because several people wrote about it from the UK, from Australia, from Canada, and from New Zealand, 4 of the 5 eyes. They wrote about the coronation that's going to take place this weekend, starting tomorrow, and then 3 days of public celebrations. And they're writing such things as, why spend so much money when there's poverty in England? There's 10.1% inflation in March. It's going to cost somewhere north of $125 million for this coronation. Is it worth it? One person wrote 51% said that the coronation should not be funded by taxpayers. Well, of course it is. So the question, and then from Australia, the question was, what do you think of the fact that Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, said he will pledge allegiance to King Charles? Well, the latest polls in Australia show that 37% only want to keep the monarchy, although it's gone up recently since Queen Elizabeth's death. Strong support remains in the 50 to 64 age group, but as you get down to lower ages, there's less and less support for the monarchy. So the question is, it's not just the wealth of the monarchy and the spending of the monarchy that's a problem, but the deeper problem, the role of the City of London, directed by the monarchy, by the House of Lords, by the peerage, by the intelligence agencies. This is the City of London continuing its power through a maintenance of an empire, with the United States as what LaRouche always called the dumb giant on a British leash. Now, if you look at the world today, we have a global financial crisis. Who's benefiting from this? The allies of the City of London on Wall Street, the city itself, Frankfurt, Brussels, but the whole financial system is coming down. The global economy is collapsing. There are food shortages, healthcare problems everywhere. At the same time, you have the role of the British, first Boris Johnson and now Sir Richard Dearloffe, the former head of MI6, going to Kiev to sabotage the possibility of negotiations. So for those who say there is no such thing as a British Empire, take a look at how many people around the world are going to be watching in fascination as this pampered, incompetent, and useless elite march down the streets of London to ensure that King Charles, who's a greenie fanatic, who's one of the people behind the World Economic Forum policy, how many people are going to watch that and be held in awe at the splendor and spectacle of the pomp and circumstances? The reality is, this is a form of government that should have died out in the 18th or 19th century. When will it? Will it continue? That depends on what the people do in those countries. Now, from Michel in Canada, he asked about Chinese meddling in Canadian politics. Now, I would respond by saying, who are the real meddlers? The Chinese have no real influence and ability to control Canadian politics. But look at Russiagate as an example. It was GCHQ and MI6 from Britain working with the CIA and the FBI. And this was confirmed by the Twitter files that these are the institutions that intervene and meddle in elections. Not the Chinese, not the Russians. The argument that the Chinese and the Russians are doing it plays into the war hawks and the military-industrial complex's insistence that we have to have a war against Russia and a war against China. The real issue here is that Russia and China have broken from that establishment and are moving in a direction with other nations of the global south toward de-dollarization and building a new financial system, because the Western governments remain completely controlled by the City of London and Wall Street. Now, You want to ask what these agencies and institutions are doing in Canada? They're keeping Trudeau in place, and in particular, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, who is an open supporter of Ukrainian neo-Nazis, which is in her family bloodlines, going back to her grandfather, who was an editor of a newspaper, the Nazi SS newspaper in Ukraine, which supported pogroms and murder of Jews, of Poles, of Romanians, of Russians in Ukraine. That's who's in power. And that's not what the Chinese want. That's what London wants and Washington wants. So instead of falling for this anti-China line, look at the reality. The policy of Trudeau and his government is totally in line with London and Washington. Now, from Angela from Italy, she asks the question, what is the interest in Europe for going along with the US? And she writes, Europe's interest should be a peaceful Ukraine and good relations with Russia. Putin said European leaders know this, but prefer to obey an Anglo-American policy while betraying their own people. Why? Well, look at the European Union. There are no sovereign governments in Europe. Maybe Hungary is an exception, Turkey to some extent, but inside the European Union, where is there a Charles de Gaulle or an Adenauer, an advocate of economic policies for the development of their nation for their people? That doesn't exist. You see it in particular in Germany, which is still a captive nation. The Germans allowed the source of cheap electricity to be blown up, probably by Biden in the United States, without raising a peep. In fact, supporting it as a means to get them to go into the crazy green policies that are advocated largely from the City of London and King Charles. So this question of Europe is that you have this example of Joseph Borrell, the foreign minister, so-called, of the European Commission, who said Europe is a garden and it's being invaded by the jungle. And as Helga said a couple of days ago, maybe Borrell should go to the jungle and see how much more civilized people are in Africa than the present governments in Europe that seem to prefer war on behalf of the military-industrial complex of the US and Great Britain, rather than peaceful cooperation with the rest of the world. The answer here is, why are the European people so complacent? And we're seeing signs that they're not staying complacent, but it still hasn't yet gotten to the point where the politicians feel the necessity of standing up against the demands from the United States. So if you live in Europe, join the peace movement, join the anti-war movement, and you can join with the Schiller Institute to make sure that those changes take place. Now, finally, I have a series of questions from Jeremiah, and I take them up because they're worth noting. He said, he referred to the global majority rejecting the West's forever wars. And he just asked if this was because of the economic policies that oppress the poorer countries. Well, of course it is. But they also don't think war is a solution. We're seeing a major effort from nations of Africa to try and stop the fighting in Sudan. No one benefits from wars except those who wish to weaken nations and reduce population, and by weakening nations, make them more susceptible to being looted from the outside. And when you look at the Ukraine situation, who's stepping in to benefit from this war? BlackRock, Vanguard, Cargill, Archer's Daniel Midland, the grain cartels, and others who are buying up Ukrainian land cheap. BlackRock in particular, which is doing the same thing in the United States. Now, then he asks a question about Biden, the investigation going on about, which alleges that Biden was accepting bribes when he was vice president. But importantly, he connects that to the coup in Kiev, the regime change coup, in which Biden was a key coordinator along with Victoria Nuland. And so he asked, could Biden be impeached for this? Well, he should be. He should be impeached for the war. He should be impeached for his role as the point person in Ukraine, because the Ukraine coup was a U.S.-directed coup against a democratically elected government. How can Biden lecture countries about democracy when he personally supervised a coup in Ukraine that overthrew an elected government and put in a position of power a neo-Nazi faction of the Ukrainian opposition, which now is very influential in the military, defense, and intelligence services in Ukraine? For that alone, Biden should be investigated and probably stand for impeachment. Will it happen? Well, I think if they narrow it only to the Hunter Biden case, it weakens the case, because the reality here is that Biden is nothing but a servant for the most greedy, miserable networks that control the military-industrial complex. We've covered this a lot. This would be the basis for a congressional investigation. And you'll find then that not only is Biden a servant of the military-industrial complex, but also to the same banking agencies that have been looting the economy, that have been benefiting from the casino economy, as millions of people are struggling to meet their day-to-day costs. Finally, he asked the question, do I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr., if he were elected president, would exonerate LaRouche? I don't know that much about what Kennedy thinks about these kinds of questions, but I have seen some interviews with him, and the point that he makes, which is very coherent with what we've been fighting for, is that you have a corporate control over government, which benefits the wealthiest people in the nation at the expense of the vast majority of the population. And he identifies the Ukraine war in that context, that the war is not of benefit to people of Ukraine, people of Europe, or to the people of the United States, but benefits the military contractors and the broader, when we talk about military-industrial complex, what we mean is the broader corporate cartels, corporate oligarchy. And RFK uses the term corporate oligarchy. So it's interesting to see him go up in the polls as he's getting more and more coverage, even as the media is trying to ignore him or portray him as a single-issue candidate, an anti-vaxxer. So we'll see what comes up with this, but I think what's important is not to rely on someone like a Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but to rely on your own activity, including your mental creative activity, in helping to de-brainwash the people of the Western world to recognize that we either move into a new security architecture or we get closer and closer to nuclear war. So thanks for joining me. Share this video, work with us, and watch the LaRouche Fireside Chat tonight. I think it's an extremely important moment in history, and it requires the full activation of the people. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.